can I vote yes and no?
Yeah, just vote in the middle.
Because I have a yes
Vote present.
and a no.
I've got a no. I'll let you go first. Welcome back to On Deadline, the Washington Examiner's political game show. I'm Christian Datoc.
And I'm Tiana Lowe, Doescher.
Each week, we bring you the biggest news in politics, deliver our takes, and then you get to vote on a winner at the end. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. We're starting Above the Fold, a segment where each of us gets a minute to talk about the biggest stories on our mind. Tiana, what's cooking today?
A recurring theme of the next 4 years will be the fact that Donald Trump is a high-variance president. Out of necessity, he's a blunt instrument that will operate in the most brute, broadest force possible. In one notable example, to get rid of the entrenched bureaucracy that has been protected by bipartisan consensus. Look no further than foreign aid. We only spend about $60 billion a year in foreign aid. That's a fraction of a percent of the federal budget. But that means some very good things will get cut and some very bad things have been temporarily paused. As far as the bad goes, why the hell are we spending $17 million on breastfeeding promotion in Tajikistan, $22 million on standardizing Serbian cheese production? On the other hand, this 90-day pause in all foreign aid includes the $6 billion a year we spend on PEPFAR. That has saved an estimated 26 million lives, and 20 million are currently reliant on PEPFAR to prevent their HIV from becoming AIDS and transmitting it. That, Christian, as a pro-life, seems like one of the government's greatest dollar values of a pro-life initiative in terms of the return on investment, and that's included in the pause.
Let's take a step back here, because this pause on foreign aid is temporary. It's not a pause. We're not stopping all of these programs. I think Secretary of State Marco Rubio
unanimously confirmed.
That's right. He said it will be a 90-day pause while the administration reviews all of these bundlings. But what I want to look at is aid to Ukraine, because Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, in case you haven't been paying attention, he said security funding from the United States is not getting paused. So it does sort of seem like the Trump administration is picking and choosing here. When the review goes through, do you think that aid will be changed, or based on the meetings between Trump and Zelensky, there's going to be a new page turned over in terms of how Trump is approaching this war?
So it's interesting that you bring up Ukraine, because in that USAID funding, which again is like another $40 billion, we spend a substantial amount on Ukraine, not just the military aid, but also in their schools, in their hospitals, and whatnot. And that's not to say that it's not a beneficial thing to try and help maternal health or whatnot. But what is the benefit on spending $6 million to eliminate hospital nurseries in Kyrgyzstan? All of it should be looked at. The question is, when you have to do the pause department-wide because you can't trust this federal aid, look, there was technically USAID was responsible for the pier in Gaza that fell apart. Technically, USAID has been responsible for designing uniforms for the Afghani troops that we left behind 1 year later. So you have all these iterations of spending money that are directly contradictory to the overriding goals of the federal government. But I do think, both the right and the left are guilty of this, pointing at whatever form or whatever government they want to dislike. Left does this all the time with Israel. Right does it sometimes with Ukraine, saying, oh, well, if we really cared about the victims of Hurricane Helene, we would stop sending money to Zelensky. Again, we spent almost $7 trillion last year, about $60 billion on just foreign aid. And that doesn't include the military spending. The military spending is a bit more, but still, we're dealing with a fraction of a percent. We're dealing with about 90% of 1% of all federal spending. But it should still be about the greater principle of the thing of, okay, if we're spending money to bolster Ukraine's military, to what end? And
to be fair, despite Donald Trump's very public posturing on the war, it doesn't really look like an end is in sight. Sure, they might begin negotiations for a peace, but like we saw in Israel, or like we saw in Gaza with Israel and Hamas, those negotiations can break down at a moment's notice, and we're on round 3 right now. Who knows if it will hold? It's going to be a long road to ending the war in Ukraine, that's for sure.
Christian, what's the biggest story you're looking at?
Donald Trump just ended the first war of his second term in office, and it only really took a couple of hours. It's not the war in Ukraine. It was a pending trade war with Colombia, because over the weekend, Trump began deporting illegal immigrants back to their native countries, but Colombian President Petro blocked a repatriation flight from landing on Colombian soil. He called Donald Trump a, quote, white slaver and vowed to oppose the incoming or new administration's policies regarding migration in the West. Now, Trump responded by placing or proposing to place 25% tariffs on all Colombian exports to the United States, and he said that would get up to 50% if Colombia didn't play ball. Turns out they immediately backtracked, and Petro offered up his own plane for some of these repatriation flights. So it does appear that Donald Trump's tariff threats are working. He's got a looming deadline to impose tariffs on Canada and Mexico this coming weekend. And based on the fact that roughly 30% of their respective GDPs are pegged directly to exports to the United States, I'd expect those negotiations to end very quickly.
The number one thing you want from these countries, you can't solve the root causes of why people want to leave Colombia. They want to leave Colombia because it's being turned into a communist hellhole under Petro's governance. What you can do is make sure that these countries are not allowed to send over their worst with impunity. And that is what has been happening. And there's a reason why Remain in Mexico, plus those safe third country agreements, made sure that this didn't happen in Trump term 1. It's why you were really able to see, even before COVID, the border tighten at the end of 2019 after a temporary spike. Because there has to be punishment where you can't asylum shop, right? If you're coming from Ukraine and, let's say, the beginning of the war with Russia, and you are being persecuted on the basis of being a Ukrainian, you're fearing that you're going to become a prisoner of war, and you run into an immediate safe country, you must seek asylum in that country. That is true as a universal tenet of law, and it's true in terms of most countries' legal codes. You must apply for asylum in the first safe country you hit. You do not get to go from Colombia to 7 other countries to come to America because you want an American job. That's just not what international human rights law exists to do. And so it is to see all these wealthy resistance libs talking about, oh, but what about the uncut flowers we import from Colombia? Okay, what about Venezuelan Tren de Aragua members being allowed to come here, stay here, and in none of the countries that they transept are they stopped and deported back to their country of origin? This is a warning sign that these countries have been put on notice. You can't just do this, we will send them back.
You know, I'm glad you brought up the flowers and the chocolates coming from Colombia that would have been subject to these 25% tariffs and maybe even 50% tariffs in a week or so, depending on how much stock you put in Donald Trump's words. And I agree with you, it seems like his threat strategy is working, at least in the West. But what I'm concerned about is how will these tariffs impact negotiations with China about a whole host of issues? Or how will they impact Russia when it comes to rapidly ending that war? I think one of the reasons we've seen success on the Trump administration's part with Colombia, and we're moving towards it with Canada and Mexico, is because none of those countries are exactly afraid of the United States, or excuse me, they are afraid of the United States. They can't go toe-to-toe with us either economically or militarily. And when you look at China, they've already got 15 to 25% tariffs on a range of goods. The Biden administration put 35% tariffs on the majority of Russian imports. So how much can Trump's sort of strong-arming these countries in the West, how can you replicate that when it comes to dealing with our real adversaries?
Time for Yays and Nays, where we give our opinions on the news of the week. Sometimes we'll agree, other times we'll disagree.
Trump should dissolve FEMA and leave disaster relief up to the states.
Can I vote yes and no?
Yeah, just vote in the middle.
Because I have a yes
vote present.
And a no.
I've got a no. I'll let you go first.
So it's not that I think disaster relief should be purely left up to the states, because I just think not only will it not work, but it will create a situation where every single time we have a disaster, we'll just get emergency spending rather than baking it into the budget. And that's always bad, because anytime you have the excuse of new emergencies, that's, it's never let an emergency go to waste. But that's what's happening right now, and that's why FEMA probably should be dissolved and restarted from scratch. We know that things like storms and hurricanes and fires happen, yet we give this no strings funding, and every time people ask for more. Why do I always have to do emergency funding for everything? While again, we did spend tens of millions of dollars on illegal aliens and resettling them in the United States, as we have explored extensively on the show. So if we're going to have an emergency funding vehicle in the federal government, which sure, okay, if we all agree that exists, it needs to be a fixed amount because by definition, that is the nature of an emergency funding vehicle, right?
Sure, that makes sense. I disagree with the fact that FEMA should be dissolved and disaster relief should be left up to the states. We did see with Hurricane Helene that some FEMA officials appeared to be politicizing the disaster. That's not okay. We need to get rid of that and make sure that anyone who needs aid in times of disaster receives it quickly from the federal government. That being said, Hurricane Helene also hit how many different states, right?
Yeah.
I think 6 states were impacted and saw serious infrastructure damage. Donald Trump on Friday was in North Carolina when he talked about dissolving FEMA. He even talked about how the disaster was just as bad across the state line in Tennessee. People in these communities that are right along the state lines often traverse the state lines, right? For business, for work. I think the idea that one municipality or one state is going to be able to, operate better than the federal government did is a short-sighted view of natural disasters. You've also got to think about all the federal coordination when it comes to bringing in the Army Corps of Engineers, right? Looking at the national weather systems for warnings and all that. The states quite literally don't have the manpower or the resources to do that. That's why FEMA exists in the first place. I just think this is too great and unpredictable of a problem to be left up to the local or state level. And yes, sure, reform FEMA, right? Make sure that they're operating and actually helping people.
And Trump brought up the idea of conditioning disaster aid. I actually think that's a good idea, but it shouldn't be for anything that is unrelated to the disaster and what
Talking about
caused
his
it.
voter ID proposal, yeah.
So the voter ID proposal, obviously I agree with that. If you don't want people to show their IDs in elections, I'm assuming you're just going to try and commit election fraud, because what other nefarious intention would you have if you didn't want to show ID the same way you show ID to get a drink or rent a movie? Something like doing at least 1 million acres of controlled burns, not approving housing that's going into the foothills that are in the disaster zone of
Reworking
fires.
water controls to make sure there isn't a shortage.
Not letting a 100 million gallon reservoir be offline for over a year before the worst fire in the state's history. Like, these are all things that absolutely should be condition aid, because it should not be considered right-wing MAGA to think you need to do controlled burns in an incredibly dry state like California that has always had wildfires. That's just called not being a complete idiot.
Now it's time for us to fill in the blank.
Blank is the difference between the Biden pardons and the Trump pardons.
This might sound simple, but there is literally no difference between Donald Trump's pardons and Joe Biden's pardons. I think they were all pretty terrible, right? On its face, Joe Biden pardoned, 6 members of his family. He commuted the sentences of a lot of nonviolent drug offenders, but he also ended up pardoning a Connecticut drug kingpin whose murder of a mother and her young 8-year-old son to stop them from testifying actually forced Connecticut to change their witness protection laws. And Senator Richard Blumenthal, again, a Democrat, has said, this was terrible, this was a mistake. They should have consulted with the ACLU and with the states to make sure that the people we're actually letting out of jail deserve to be let out of jail.
You can't just get a list from an activist and be like, oh, well, if the group said so, then it must be right.
Yeah.
Like, you don't think to maybe stick it into ChatGPT and say, hey, is there anyone on this list that's also committed heinous violent offenses beyond a reasonable doubt?
Yeah, and just because you're working hard in prison doesn't mean you've been fully rehabilitated. I mean, the penal system should be used to rehabilitate people back so they can contribute to society, right? We all agree with that. But when you look at Donald Trump's pardons for these January 6th 14 participants, including Stewart Rhodes, the leader of the Oath Keepers, notorious for his eye patch, I think, what are we actually doing here? Sure, Trump promised to do it on the campaign trail. And sure, Stewart Rhodes wasn't actually in the Capitol, but he did plead guilty to seditious conspiracy, right? He quite literally moved the Oath Keepers to Washington, D.C. and basically said, yeah, we're going to take over the Capitol. I just don't understand what the presidential pardon is about anymore, right? Because it doesn't seem to be going to people who actually deserve a pardon and are working, again, to go back and help improve their local community.
I think precedent is the difference between the Biden pardons and the Trump pardons because Biden did it first. You know, there was a working theory that Trump wasn't going to do the pardon for the especially egregious 14 cases of the J6ers. And he waited until Biden pardoned the entire Biden crime family, which I can feel very safe saying now that the entire family got a pardon. Imagine being Jill at that family dinner, being like, am I the only one in this family that didn't like commit like an actual crime other than, you know, crimes against the American people by being Edith Wilson? And with regards to the J6 stuff, again, Trump, blunt instrument with broad strokes. The fact is, everyone agreed with the anti-J6 stance after it happened. The fact that all of those folks were treated unconscionably, were treated the same, is why Trump's like, screw this, we're just pardoning or granting clemency towards everyone. And that is not what I would have done. I don't think it's ever good to grant that broad of clemency. But like, let's be real, from a civil libertarian perspective, what the DOJ was trying to do was so beyond the pale in, you know, for instance, you had people that were ready to plead guilty for genuinely, you know, breaking a window in the Capitol, which like is not walking into a building peacefully. That is, you know, assaulting federal property. You should have to serve some jail time for that. On to our last laugh, where we discuss some of the lighter news of the week. Back in DC, we've all been waiting for it. Just moments in style, in grace, in class. And I am not talking about Melania Trump. I am talking about the pandas.
Oh, we're back.
Here. We're so back.
America is back, everybody. Yeah, the national pandas sort of became a little bit of a hot topic issue when they were recalled to Beijing by China, right? The two that were originally at the National Zoo have been since sent to San Diego. And we got two brand new pandas here in DC. And let's just say the people on the ground were reacting as you'd expect. There was an official ribbon cutting ceremony. There was one of DC's famous brass go-go bands there. It was a fun and like wholesome family setting to, you know, let everybody at home remember this isn't the worst town in the world, right? There are some good things in Washington.
And you know what? Like the whole inauguration week, it was freezing here.
Yeah.
And yet still people celebrating. Nope. I mean, I didn't see any riots, just peaceful protest, panda parade. We're so back.
It was great. That being said, it was the inauguration, and Republicans are already laying the groundwork for Donald Trump to have a third term in office. Can you guys just figure it out already? I mean, seriously. One, this is ridiculous. There's a reason we haven't had a president serve more than 2 terms since Franklin Roosevelt, correct? And I think if you take a step back and you look at the election results and you say, okay, Donald Trump and Republicans got a clear mandate to govern, to address these very pressing issues, which the Biden administration failed on, maybe address the frickin' issues, guys, right?
Yeah.
No one wants to, after just a few days in office, you guys saying, well, we're going to change the Constitution, let Donald Trump stay president for life. What are you doing?
I mean,
what are you doing?
I get it's just a giant virtue signal or vice signal or like whatever you want to call
Brown
it. And like
nosing
it's
is what I'll
not
call
serious, but like, one, Republicans don't be cringe challenged. Like, I know it's hard, but we can do it. We can just not embarrass ourselves. Like, that's what Brat Summer was for the libs to get all the cringe out. We don't have to come back and do it. But also it's like, men will literally rather try and trend on Twitter to get Trump's approval than go to therapy for their daddy.
No, it's tough. I don't know.
You know what you can do if you're in Congress and you really want to impress Trump? Just get the one big beautiful bill done. I'm begging you. Just do that because I do not want 62% of Americans to get a tax hike in 2026, which is what will happen. But it's easier to trend on Twitter than it is to actually like, you know, try and generate tax revenue or cut spending.
For sure.
Things like we pretended we once upon a time cared about.
You know, and for this next clip, as we're playing it out, I would like our producer to go ahead and play the Succession theme song because Donald Trump's family was at the inauguration. They were on the riser at the inaugural parade. And no one, I mean no one, got a louder round of applause than Barron Trump, the clear successor to take on the Trump dynasty down the line. Apologies to Don Jr. and Aaron, boys. It ain't happening for you.
No, Secretary of the Cyber. There's something He has, what do the kids call it, Riz?
Oh, God.
Barron Trump has the Riz. No, I mean, he's a meme whisperer in chief. There's something very memeable about him. And as long as he welcomes it, because even though he's over 18, I still feel weird about making the kids into public figures when, like, they don't.
It's especially strange for me because last time we saw Barron, he was like 12 years old.
And he was only like 6'1" as opposed to 6'9".
Yeah, and I do think sort of his, I guess, behind the scenesiness of it all compared to Don Jr. or Eric or even Ivanka during the first term has lent to his mystique, but he's leaning into it now. And like on the riser, he got the standing ovation, waved to the crowd, sort of pumped him up a little bit, tried to get a little bit more. Meanwhile, you had Eric doing the weirdest thing in the world with his hands in the rotunda. I'm curious to see because, I mean, there has been this obsession not only with first children, but you look over on the other side of the pond, the royal family, right?
Yeah.
And people love the drama. I'm curious to see if Barron actually has a role in this administration.
Yeah.
I mean, we know he's in college, and we know he didn't engage on anything last time around, partially because he was too young. But he has massive sway, especially with these young voters. I'm curious to see if the Trump White House will try to leverage it.
Yeah, I mean, I actually mad respect for Melania for keeping his privacy the same way to bring up another former First Lady. Michelle Obama did a good job with her girls, just letting them live their lives and be children. And there's something very nice about that.
Well, that's all the time we've got for this episode. Let us know in the comments who you thought won today's clash, Tiana or myself. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this week's pod. I'm Christian Datoc.
I'm Tiana Lowe Doescher.
And you can check out more of our great reporting at washingtonexaminer.com. We'll see you guys next week.